Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing the documentary Dahomey, premiering on Mubi on December 13th. Briefly directed by Diop, the film documents the return of 26 royal treasures to Benin. In 2021, the Republic of Benin, formerly Dahomey, convinced France to repatriate 26 artifacts looted by French colonizers. Despite the significance, 7,000 plus still remain, and the decision on which artifacts to return solely lie with the French. The documentary is very short, it's about an hour long, and largely focuses on the process of returning these pieces back to Benin. Matty meticulously documents their packaging, loading, unloading, and unpackaging. It also documents the public's reaction to their return as well as their opening night. Because most of the documentary focuses on the return of these artifacts, Matty makes the creative decision to infuse these statues with life using lyrical text written by Haitian author Mackenzie Orsel. And most of the documentary is actually told from the perspective of these artifacts. These pieces quite literally narrate their journey back home. And the voice is very old, very haunting, very raspy to signal old age and wisdom. And listening to this voice, it was definitely a risky decision. However, it definitely pays off because it captures the fear, the anger, and the anticipation for the future. Benin has been preparing for their return for some time, and even they're a little bit nervous. Many European countries are very reluctant to return the artwork they have stolen, and the argument they make is that countries like Benin don't have the infrastructure to keep them safe, and returning them would actually risk destroying or damaging them, even though they were nearly destroyed when they stole them. Another reason why countries like France are very reluctant to return these artifacts is because returning them would imply that they stole them in the first place. For decades, these artifacts have been labeled and shown off by foreigners, which means that the history of countries like Benin have been altered and manipulated. Returning these artifacts is essential to reversing the colonial narrative. For the first time, these artifacts will be showcased, labeled, and narrated by the countries they originated from. And the first half of this documentary does a great job of really emphasizing what a monumental moment this is. Again, we're literally watching them travel from one time zone to another. Just seeing the enormous effort that this took is really enough to get us to understand how monumental this moment is. Now, the second half of the documentary revolves around a town hall with mostly youth discussing how the return of these artifacts will impact their society. I felt that this town hall meeting was incredibly riveting. Most of these students describe being culturally indoctrinated by the West. They grew up on Avatar and Marvel movies. And many students also note that whenever they learned about their history, it kind of filled them with a sense of despair because they often viewed themselves as victims. And many history textbooks unfortunately revolve around colonization or events leading up to colonization. And what is often lost and minimized is who these people were prior to these invasions. And students describe how seeing the artifact, they didn't even realize how emotional of a moment this would be. Like, students describe crying, and it really altered the way they viewed themselves. It kind of instilled a newfound pride in them they didn't know was possible. There's definitely a difference between seeing yourself as a descendant of a slave and a descendant of an Amazon. And the way that history is sometimes narrated can paint a portrait of a people as weaker or naturally more subservient than others. And you can see this in the way that France framed this return. They did not use the word return. They used the term repatriated to imply goodwill and good intentions, when in fact it's a very desperate attempt to maintain influence in a region that filled with countries that really want nothing to do with them. The return of these artifacts trigger a call of action, which can be heard throughout this town hall meeting. And even though 7,000 plus artifacts remain, students really try their best to see the glass as half full instead of half empty. And a lot of the reason that France does not want to return these artifacts is because they don't want to retract parts of history that are essential to not only its survival, but its reputation in the world. And the way that these students are revisiting their history, or the way they're kind of talking about their feelings regarding these artifacts, it definitely does put France in a negative light. France, as well as other Western countries, have had a strong hold on knowledge. And one of the points a student makes is how often intelligence is measured by the way they're able to view their own existence through the lens of the colonizer. And they can't even really articulate their own experience using their own language. And I think that's why museums in particular can be very damaging institutions, because these are Western institutions and a lot of them are there to just showcase their dominance over others. And I think what I really appreciate about this town hall meeting is how they were able to really articulate how simply seeing these artifacts was life altering, and how they really want to encourage other people to see it, because it doesn't seem like a big deal until you're there. I felt like the conversations that were kept in the documentary in this town hall, in addition to watching these artifacts return, makes this a very unique documentary. The best way I can describe it is by stealing a quote from director Payal Kapatia. In a podcast, she describes how you should not be making political films. Instead, you should be making a film politically, and I feel like this perfectly describes Dahomey. The documentary does a great job of showing us what cultural colonization looks like, and then it offers a space to discuss how this can be reversed. The first half of the documentary, we literally see these artifacts basically in a prison, in these cold spaces under surveillance. And there's just so much red tape involved in securing their release. Once they're out, the atmosphere totally changes, and suddenly what was inaccessible and guarded and totally out of reach becomes available for everyone. Listening to this town hall meeting, it really invites people to reassess their past and maybe look into parts of their history that have been minimized, deemed trivial. When the students were describing their upbringing and growing up on Marvel movies and all these Hollywood movies, it's very relatable. And at first you don't really think anything of it. You're like, oh, that's amazing. The world is getting smaller. People are connecting. But the more you think about it, the more terrifying it becomes. Like, one student noted how he could basically recognize a Marvel reference over one from his own culture. Sometimes we don't realize how indoctrinated we are until we're exposed to something that forces us to rethink our entire existence. One of the attendees of the opening night noted how the return of these artifacts parallels the return of people back to the continent. Many people have been returning to not just Benin, but other parts of Africa to learn more about their history and their background. The return of these artifacts is really critical to restoring faith and pride in a region unfortunately filled with misinformation and lies. And so this is a very, very unique documentary. It's only 1 hour, but it's just incredibly impactful. And I invite all of you to look out for it. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.